get started, I like for class to be very interactive, so I'm going to ask a lot of questions, and it will be a very awkward silence if nobody talks. So I will also say I'm showing some stuff on the slides that is probably going to be some fairly small type. So if everybody wants to move forward, you can. I did not do printouts so that you could have certain things in front of you. But if you're hard of seeing and you'd like to move forward, you can. If you can't see it then, it's not my fault because I warned you. So we have been, my family and I, at Cookeville Church of Christ now for about a little over a year, something like that. We're a fairly new congregation. We have been about a year and a half now. We're located on North Dixie, about a quarter mile north of Tech. So right where the football field and everything sits at that red light, you turn and go north of Tech, and we're down just a little ways on the left. So I've got a remote somewhere. Nope, Chris gave it to me earlier, and I probably lost it already. You see one sitting there? Is it back there? Okay. It's back here, she said. There it is. All right, so when we look at the Bible, especially the Old Testament, and we start reading these stories, and I'm always hesitant to call them quote-unquote stories, because it puts in our minds sometimes it's like fairy tales or like cartoon type stuff. And I don't know if maybe that's a fault of ours sometimes when we're teaching children. I know when I think back to like Noah's Ark, what I have in my mind is just this nice little curved boat that sits out there, and you've got a giraffe head sticking up and a lion head sticking up and all that. Well, in reality, that's not anything what it looked like. All right? It's not the shape of the boat. You had one window on the thing, one door. There weren't windows and air vents all over the place. And we just seem to picture in our head it's like this fantasy world that we're not really a part of. And I also think sometimes we see it almost like a sitcom. Right? That we have like these individual episodes. So we'll read this story about Abraham. And then we go over some chapters and we'll read this about Joseph. And all these things happen in their own areas. These people didn't interact with each other. We're talking thousands and thousands of years that went between everything. But is that reality? So what I want us to do this morning is try to look at some of the stories in the Old Testament, and let's try to put them in real world. How realistic is our view of the Old Testament, the timelines of when things happened? Can we tie it back into secular events, basically non-biblical events, and try to start seeing a connection with the things that we might read in history books or we watch on National Geographic or something like that? So, I want to start with this. How old were people prior to the flood? How old did people get? Old. Throw out a number. Hundreds. How many hundreds? 800, 900. I mean, you're talking nearly 1,000 years. All right. How old is the earth roughly? Which I know we don't know an exact number. 6,000 to 10,000 is a good estimate of what many people think. So if somebody lived 1,000 years and the earth is 6,000 years old, they were alive for a pretty good majority of the history of this planet, if you think about it that way. But today, obviously no one's coming close to that, right? And so it's hard for us to think about and to understand how in the world somebody could live that long. But also, I mean, think back today, what's the farthest back generation-wise is going to be living at the same time? How many generations might you have living at the same time? 4 maybe. I think one time I saw a picture that had 5 generations in it. That it was a little bitty baby that was just born, and you had a great-great-grandparent still in the picture that was almost 100 years old. So, I mean, it's very rare to get that. Most of the time you get 4, sometimes 3. So if Adam, first man, was 900 years old, How many generations did he live with? Yeah. You may be closer than you think. Let's look at something. So, I created a chart. I'm a nerd. It's okay. I admit it. I know it. I've come to live with it. So, when I was in college, I did this. Turn in your Bibles to Genesis 5. I wanted to see if I could try to map out how old everybody was and see if I could create a timeline, almost like a family tree of people in the Bible. So in Genesis 5, we have a very interesting section. And I tell you, how long do I have before this is over, the class? 9:45? Okay. Yeah, I don't want to read it all. But if you look at Genesis 5, you have a section called the family of Adam. That's the heading in mind. Some will say the genealogy of Adam. And what it does is this is one of those sections that so-and-so lived 130 years, begot so-and-so, then lived another 800 years and died. That person lived so many years, begot so-and-so, they lived so many more years and died. And it goes from Adam all the way to Noah. Well, all you have to do is put a little bit of math in there, because it tells you how long they lived before the child was born, and then tells you how long they lived after it, so you can add up and get people's age when they died. And I decided to map this out. And so I did the nerdiest thing possible, and I put it in Excel, and I made a bar chart. But I think what we found was pretty interesting. And this is where I'm saying, like the name Adam, that's how small the type's going to be. I'll tell you the names that are on there, but if you want to move forward to see that a little better, you can. So I made a chart. Has this got a little pointer on it? Hey. So you can see years down here at the bottom. It starts at 0, and I put it 500 years, 1,000, 1,500, 2,000, 2,500. So over here is year 0. This is creation. It says Adam lived 930 years total. So I can get a rough estimate here of how long it looks like he lived. Then it went to the next one. It said that Adam lived 130 years and begot a son in his own likeness after his image and named him Seth. After he begot Seth, the days of Adam were 800 years. He had sons and daughters, so all the days of Adam lived were 930 years and he died. So no Adam here is 930. Then it said Seth lived 105 years and begot Enosh. So I take and put Seth on there. Well, I know Seth was 130 years after creation because that's how old Adam was when he had Seth. And then Seth, if I read through it, he lived a total of 912 years. And so he died 1,042 years after creation. So you see how I did this, and you just kind of start mapping it out. So I did this through that whole section of Genesis 5, and you come up with this. And I know that's a lot to take in. So we're going to sit and look at this for a minute, and I want us to talk about it. So we have, if you can't see the names, there's Adam, then Seth, Enosh, Canaan, Mahalalel. I always joke with the kids, it's Mahalalala. Jared, Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech, and Noah. So those are the different generations from Adam all the way to Noah. And these dates all come directly out of Genesis chapter 5 and that genealogy, how old everybody was. So, if you look at this, tell me some things that jump out to you. They all died. They did do that. And none of these guys are living anymore. They all died. I haven't had anybody ever say that. That is correct. That's a huge one to me. These are not stories we read about in the Old Testament where they're their own little isolated events. They like happen in their own little pods over here like they're a sitcom or TV show. These people lived all at the same time. Notice here, Adam, 930 years. Lamech, who was Noah's dad, was born 874 years after creation, which means Lamech and Adam lived, 56 years on the planet at the same time? Did they know each other? Maybe. I don't know. I mean, the Bible doesn't tell us if they knew each other. Like, did they have family reunions when everybody got back together? Yeah. Yeah, it's not in there, so it didn't really matter to us in terms of salvation and things like that. But to me, it puts the Old Testament in perspective of these people. Well, let's look at it this way. Could Noah have ever met Adam? Well, Noah was born 1,056 years after creation. Adam only lived 930. So Noah was not born before Adam died. But Lamech and Adam lived at the same time. Now, how many of you, when you were kids, remember sitting with a grandfather or a great-grandfather or something and listen to them tell stories? Imagine you go sit at your great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather and listen to him tell you stories about naming the animals. Lamech could have done that with Adam. Now, was Lamech on the ark? No. You had how many on the ark? 8. And who were they? And their spouses. Noah, his 3 sons, and the 4 spouses. All right? So I know Lamech was not on there, but Noah would not have got a first-hand account of creation. He would have had to talk to Adam himself in order to get a first-hand creation account of it. But he could have got a second-hand account. Lamech, maybe he possibly sat and talked to Adam and told his kids about it. So when we talk about, okay, by the time we get to the flood and things like that, well, these are just stories that have been passed down for generations and generations, and it's probably gone through so many different people. It's changed some, and it didn't have to go through that many generations in order to get to Noah. It had to go through basically Noah's dad, potentially. What else jumps out to you on here? And I have the date of when the flood happened, because it says in Genesis 7:6 that Noah was 600 years old at the flood. Well, if we know he was born 1,056 years after creation, the flood happened 1,656 years after creation. Again, I'm not pulling these numbers anywhere except Genesis 5. That's where every bit of it comes from. So if you think of it that way, it's 1/4 of all history of this planet occurred prior to the flood. 3/4 of it has happened after, if we assume a 6,000-year-old earth. When did Methuselah die? What's special about Methuselah? He's the oldest person that we have record of. Now, was he the oldest to ever live? I mean, the Bible just doesn't tell us of anybody else. But he's the oldest one recorded in history. 969 years old. When did he die? Huh? He did. Methuselah didn't. Methuselah. Enoch was taken. Okay, well, let's talk about Enoch real quick. Why is Enoch's life so much shorter than everybody else's? He was the one that God took him. All right? Do you think, well, Adam wouldn't have been aware of it. Adam was already dead at that time. Do you think Seth knew about it? That his, what would it be, son, grandson, great. So Seth's great-grandson didn't die and was taken. How quickly do you think word about that got around to the rest of the family? I'm sure it's probably something they talked about for a little while. It's like, wow, what in the world? But Methuselah, which would be Enoch's son, what's unique about the year he died? 1,656 years after creation is when he died. That's the same year the flood happened. So let's think about this for a second. What does that mean? Possibly. The Bible doesn't say that Methuselah died in the flood. We can just add up the numbers and we know it occurred in the same year. So here's where my mind starts to wonder. What if, we know Noah was a righteous man, right? Was Lamech around to maybe help Noah build the ark to survive the flood? I mean, his dad was there. Lamech died in 1651, and I'm a number of years after creation, so he died 5 years before the flood, which means he was there for a majority of the time the ark was being built. Did Noah's dad assist in it? Possibly. I mean, there's a very good possibility Noah likely hired people to help him do this stuff. The Bible never says he had to build it by himself. But was Methuselah around to see the ark being built? Yeah, he was there. Is it possible that Methuselah was also a righteous man? I mean, Noah had to have been taught by somebody. It was passed down. I mean, we can read in Kings and Chronicles, we know that the sons don't always follow what the dad did. But it's possible. Lamech may have been righteous. He just wasn't there to get on the ark. He'd already died. Methuselah might have been righteous. Is it possible that God was purposely waiting until Methuselah passed away before he sent the flood because he knew Methuselah wouldn't survive the ark? So he wasn't going to put him on the ark knowing he was 969 years old and possibly wouldn't be able to survive it. He waited until Methuselah's death, then he was going to let the flood happen. Maybe he was not a righteous man. Maybe he died in the flood. I've often wondered, did something happen to Methuselah to where he did not die a natural death? What was the world like at the time of the flood? Oh, it was evil. I mean, the fact you could only find 8 righteous people on the planet. All right? And it's not like there were a couple hundred people alive. It's 1,600 years of history of people multiplying and stuff. There's a lot of people on the planet. Maybe Methuselah got murdered. I don't know. And God said, all right, I'm done. That's the straw that broke the camel's back. Get in the ark. It's getting ready to start raining. And again, this is all speculation in my head. But what creating a chart like this did is it made me start looking at things a little differently when I'm reading Genesis. That I now understand these people lived at the same time. Their lives may have overlapped and they interacted with each other. Y'all see where I'm going with it? So, I continued to be nerdy, and I jumped over to Genesis chapter 10, and I did the same thing. There's another genealogy. And what it does is it goes from Noah all the way to Abraham. So now I've shifted the first line here is year 1000, and it's the exact same concept. And so there's 1,000, 1,500, 2,000, 2,500, so that's 2,500 years after creation down there on the bottom. And it goes Noah, Shem, Arphaxad, Selah, Eber, Peleg, Ru, Serug, Nahor, Terah, and Abram, which is Abraham. What do you notice about this chart when you lay them out? They didn't live as long. There are actually 2 significant changes in lifespans that occurred. Where are those at? Well, who on here is significantly older than everybody else? Noah. Noah's 950. Shem, his son, was the next one, oldest after this, was 600. Then you have a jump here. You start getting into the 400s. So there's a significant drop in life expectancy, almost cut in half right after the flood. There's another drop in life expectancy that occurred right here in Peleg's life, where you're dropping down into the 200s now. And it starts just kind of shrinking as it goes. Why?
The firmament no longer existed. Once the earth was surrounded by a firmament, and that actually helped with the flood, because that protective barrier probably from the sun no longer existed. The sun is actually reducing I'm speculating.
No, that's exactly my explanation. That's what I personally believed happened. Again, the Bible doesn't tell us for sure, but it does make statements. There's one specific statement made that makes us think there was a protective barrier around the earth. And it's in the Bible. What does it say? Where did the waters from the flood come from? There's 2 places.
From the earth, from the sky.
That you had the waters of the deep, which I've often thought if you watch science shows on TV, they find like these just big open holes just randomly out in places that there's no explanation for them. They don't know why they're there. I've often wondered, is that a hole that God opened up where water came out for the flood? Possible. But it says the windows of heaven were opened. So some of the water for the flood came from inside the earth. The rest of the water came down from heaven. We don't have that much water in our atmosphere today from a rain standpoint to be able to flood the earth. There's a very good possibility, and a lot of scientists believe this, biblical scientists that don't go back to evolution and all that, that the planet was actually surrounded by a layer of moisture. And God allowed that layer of moisture now to fall to the earth, and it flooded the earth. What would that have done, having a layer of moisture around the earth? What would that have created from an environment down here? It's almost like a greenhouse. So there have been, archaeologists have found things like palm trees buried in the Arctic ice. It's there. I mean, there's no arguing it. They found it. Well, if there truly was a protective barrier all around the earth, and it created like a greenhouse effect, was it possible that the climate of the earth prior to the flood was more of a tropic type environment over the entire planet? Not that you had the two extremes on the poles where it's really cold and everything at the equator is hotter, that you had more of a uniform temperature around the earth. Could also explain why dinosaurs didn't survive. Now, did some dinosaurs survive after the flood? Yes. We got alligators today. That was a dinosaur. I mean, it's a dinosaur. You look at it. All right. Turtles. That's the kind of stuff like they would explain. Now, did you have T-Rex that looked like it looked in Jurassic Park? Maybe, I don't know. Were they as fierce and horrible as people like to dream up? Maybe, maybe not. But we do know there were some animals that were very big. Job tells about the behemoth and the leviathan. But is it possible that certain animals that were even taken on the ark couldn't survive the new climate that existed after the flood because you no longer had that protective barrier around the earth because the windows of heaven were open and that water came down? Could that also explain why you have this massive drop right here in life expectancy? You now have UV rays beginning to hit people that were potentially before that being blocked out from the sun. So you've got impacts of the sun now impacting our bodies. There's the other drop in life expectancy. Happened in Peleg's life. What happened during the life of Peleg? Something very specific happened. And it is in Genesis chapter 10, verse 25. It says, to Eber were born two sons. The name of one was Peleg, for in his day the earth was divided. What does that mean? What happened, what event, and everybody will know the event when we say it. What happened during Peleg's lifetime? The Tower of Babel occurred during Peleg's lifetime. It's when the earth was divided. Everybody was split and they all went their own direction. That occurred, I mean, we know it occurred during his life. The Bible says it. All right. Now, when during this 239-year span did it occur? That we don't know for sure. We just know it happened sometime in his lifetime. All right. Could something related to people now being scattered all across the earth impact life expectancies? Maybe. I don't know. There are not as many of them there now to help each other out. Knowledge kind of lost a little bit between different groups so maybe some medicinal type things that one group knew that the other group didn't know, and I don't know. But it's interesting to think about. What really happened to all this? This one is neat. Abraham died 2,123 years after creation. When did Shem die? This is why I said everybody scoot forward, because you can't see the numbers. Yeah, 35 years after Abraham died. Shem, the son of Noah, outlived Abraham. That's fascinating to me. Did Shem and Abraham know each other? So now, Abraham, the father of everything we read about in the Old Testament, it's Father Abraham, the children of Israel, all that lineage comes down through him. Even Islam today ties its roots back to Abraham. He could have potentially sat with Shem, and Shem told him what the planet was like prior to the flood. So he could have got a first-hand account of what the world was like before that. He could have known how wicked everything really was. And so when he's trying to lead his family, and you get the children of Israel, they're all starting to split and do their things, he knows what can really happen if people break away and stop following God. He knew what the results would be because he could have sat and Shem told him all about it, because Shem witnessed the destruction. It's fascinating to me. If you look during Abraham's lifetime, his children and stuff, when they were born, I didn't include it on here because I'd already nerded out enough. Abraham's children, what was his son's name? Isaac. Isaac's children were Jacob and Esau. If you continue to read and you add up the ages and you get into some later parts in Genesis, it tells how old Jacob was when he got married and all that. Shem could have been at Jacob's wedding. Shem was still alive at the time, which is just really cool to me. So Israel himself could have sat and talked to somebody who was on the ark. Now, let's go back to the Tower of Babel thing. I'll tell you what, we'll go there in a minute. This is where I want us to start tying it into secular history. Because if you read history books in school, or you watch channels on TV, National Geographic, things like that, they're not ever going to tie in the stuff that happened from a biblical standpoint. What is this? The pyramids of Giza. All right? By far the most famous pyramids that exist on our planet. Archaeologists say they're about 4,500 years old. Is that realistic based on the charts we just looked at? Well, what we would have to know is where are we today from how old the earth is. That's why I asked a minute ago roughly how old. 6,000 to 10,000 years is what most people think the age of the earth is. Well, let's go back to this chart. There was a man by the name of, let me find it here, the Archbishop James Ussher. He wrote, and he wins the award for the weirdest name of a book, The Annals of the Old Testament Deduced from the First Origins of the World. That was the name of a book that he wrote in the year 1650. The Archbishop James Ussher. This is what he claims the age of the earth is. He claims he mapped it back all the way to like the day creation happened. Like he can tell you the month and the day. That's maybe a little far-fetched in my book. But a lot of the maps, if you can buy even from like Apologetics Press and different places, you can show where it starts laying things out and starts showing like the Bronze Age and all these different times that existed with the biblical timeline laid on top of it. So according to James Ussher, these are the dates that he says in his book. He says creation occurred in the year 4004 BC. Now, is he exactly right? It gives a 6,000-year-old earth if you look at it that way roughly. I personally believe he's probably close. Now, does he know it happened on May 28th, 4004 BC? I haven't read the book, but I'm a little, I don't know about that. But what does that mean now if if he's right, let's give that assumption, that the earth really was created in the year 4004 BC. That means the flood occurred roughly 2300 BC, something like that. 2400, somewhere in there, 2350. And Abraham lives, he got 2004 BC, would have been during Abraham's first 50, 60 years of life. Something like that. So Abraham was roughly 4,000 years ago. Now, I know when the covenant of Abraham occurred because the Bible tells us how old Abraham was in Genesis 17:1. We know how old he was when God made the promise to him. So this green line represents when the covenant to Abraham was made, which is also interesting. Do you think Shem knew about it, the promise to Abraham? There's a good possibility that he may have known about it. And Eber and all them, now Peleg and some of the others had already died before then. But where does the Tower of Babel fall in this? The Tower of Babel is going to happen somewhere here in the life of Peleg during this. We don't really know when, but according to James User, he says he knows the date of it. The date he came up with was 2242 BC. If his dates are right, it does actually put it in the lifespan of Peleg. Now, it's very, very early in Peleg's life. I mean, he might have been like a teenager when it occurred, but that would still make the Bible true. It would line up with the dates that the archbishop came up with. So maybe he's close on his years at least. So that would put the Tower of Babel at 2242 BC. That would also put, well, let's look at it this way. I got about 10 minutes left. We would be good. What would Noah have needed in order to build the ark? Well, he needs wood. He needs workers. If I want to go out and I want to build a boat today, what are some other very essential things I would need? How am I going to hold the wood together? I know we put pitch on it, but that was more of a waterproofing type thing. How do you hold the boards together? Nails. He's going to need nails. He's going to need hammers, stuff like that. If these dates from James User are correct, do you know when the Bronze Age occurred? It would have been during the life of Noah. So the Bronze Age, 3,500 years ago, whatever it came out to be, would have occurred. That means Noah would have had nails available to him. He would have had bracketry could have been made for hinges and stuff like that. He would have had hammers available to him. He would have had the physical tools necessary to build something like that, which to me is fascinating. People say, oh, you couldn't have built something like that long ago. These dates are right, he could have. The materials existed. But let's look now at this. So pyramids. The pyramids of Giza are the most famous pyramids in the world, right? They are right here in Egypt. These stars on the map are other pyramids around the world. We don't hear as much about them. The Mayan pyramids down here in Mexico, we might hear a little bit more about just because of our proximity to them. In the Aztecs, you actually have a pyramid over in Rome. In Italy, there's one in China. I'm going to flip through the slides of them. So this is a Mayan pyramid. The Aztec pyramid. This is one that's in Rome, Italy today. All right, you can actually drive and go find this. There's Egypt. We saw that one. There's pyramids in Sudan, Mesopotamia, and China. What's interesting about all these? They all look like a pyramid, right? They all look very, very similar. Now, have any of you ever watched on Discovery Channel, there's this show called Ancient Aliens. It's fun to watch sometimes. There's this guy that's got this crazy spiked up hair. It's like, he's fun to watch if nothing else. Where do they say the pyramids came from? Aliens. Of course, I mean, it's on a show called Ancient Aliens. They're going to think they came from aliens. But why do people think aliens built the pyramids? People who don't believe in God, why would they think aliens built pyramids? Yeah, different from what they were raised in. They didn't have the intelligence or the means to. I think they might have, but to me there's another big reason. You have these pyramids all over the world that all look very similar to each other. What was communication like back then? Could I shoot an email to somebody on the other side of the world? Or shoot a text message to somebody on the other side of the world? Pull them up on a FaceTime chat. I couldn't even send a letter through the mail to them. Communicating with somebody on the other side of the world was non-existent at the time. You didn't do it. A lot of people didn't even know the other people existed. So how is it that you have a similar structure built all over this planet that all look very close to the same in civilizations that didn't know about each other or didn't communicate with each other? They'll say, well, it had to have been aliens then. I mean, how else could it happen? Somebody came from outer space and built them all. What about this? So if we go to Genesis chapter 11 in verse 4, the Hebrew word used for tower in that verse is the word Migdal. M-I-G-D-A-L. Migdal. You go back to the original language, that word means a tower, an elevated platform, even think of like a raised flower bed, just some kind of raised bed. That word is used, I don't know if I wrote it down in here. Nope, I didn't write it down. 5 minutes, all right. So, the word's used a couple hundred times in the Bible, this Migdal. Most every single time that it is used in Scripture, it is talking from a military standpoint. All right? Which means a Migdal, there's things, they're not meant to be flimsy. And this is where I think we go back to the children's stories. When you all have thought of the Tower of Babel, what did you all picture in your head? I've often thought something like out of Dr. Seuss. And I've thought it ever since I was a little kid, where you have this nice cylinder tower and it just kind of winds and it's kind of flopping around and stuff like that, and they're just trying to build it as high as you can. Almost like you take Legos and you just try to piece one piece over top of the other and you try to build something that looks like the Eiffel Tower, just as tall as you can make it. That's what I've often envisioned the Tower of Babel to be like. But according to Scripture, it was a Migdal. That's the Hebrew word that was used, which is often used from a military standpoint. Think of fortresses. Those things are not flimsy. They are intended to be sturdy. They're not going to get knocked down. You're not going to knock walls over on them. What is the most stable structure that you can build to keep it from tipping over? A pyramid, a triangle. You're not going to flip it over. Is it possible that what the Tower of Babel was actually a thing called a ziggurat? This is a ziggurat. These exist around the world. It's a known thing that people who build structures today, if you tell them, hey, I want to build a ziggurat, this is what they would imagine. And if I'm thinking from a military standpoint, you're not going to knock this over. There's no wall to knock down. That thing's pretty sturdy. What does that also look like? Looks like a fort. Yeah. Kind of shaped like a pyramid too, isn't it? So is it possible that what the Tower of Babel they were building was a ziggurat or something resembling a pyramid? And so now you have, they're split during Peleg's life. He said everybody went their own directions. We're told that in Genesis 10. So when they go out to their own places and they start building stuff, what are they going to build? What they know. Well, what they knew was a Migdal, a ziggurat, potentially a pyramid. Could that explain why we have pyramids all over the world today? And they all have a very similar look and structure to them because they all came from a common source, which was potentially the Tower of Babel. Does it start kind of putting some puzzle pieces together when you look at it this way? And all this came from mapping out ages of people and genealogies. Those verses we just breezed through and like, I don't want to look at that. I can't understand those names. So, if we start looking at some of the pyramids, this is the pyramid in China. Does that not look very similar to that? That's a ziggurat today. Those kind of look very similar to that, right? So, if we want to look at the ages of things then, you would think the flood would have wiped out all the pyramids if they had built them at the flood. So if we use the dates from James Ussher, sorry, I may go a minute over. According to James Ussher, the Tower of Babel was the year 2242 BC. That's when he says it occurs, which would put it roughly 4,250 years ago. That means the pyramids that exist today should be younger than that, right? The Sudan pyramids are dated to 3,700 years ago. The Mayan pyramids, 2,300 years ago. Roman, the one in Italy, is 2,000 years ago. The Aztec, 600 years ago. Now the ones in Egypt and China, Egypt it says is 4,500 years ago. 4,250, you're in the general vicinity. Where did all these events in the Old Testament occur at? Right over around where Egypt was at. Maybe Egypt was one of the first ones that got built after they scattered after the Tower of Babel, because it was the closest place. They didn't have to travel as far. The China one, they say it's 6,700 years old. But it's not millions. They're not claiming it's millions of years old. It's putting these in the same general vicinity that would fall in line with the biblical story of when the flood occurred. So that's really all I had for class. And the purpose of this was, when we read Genesis and we read the stories in the Old Testament, don't think of these things as isolated events that occurred over their own decades and centuries and stuff, and nobody knew each other, nobody talked to each other. And by the way, when we read history books in school, that's real history on earth, and this is just Bible history over here that's its own little thing. It's not. It's all connected. It's all one piece together. So any questions over any of this? I know there was a lot of stuff really fast. Hopefully it makes us think. Yeah. I think it's fascinating. But again, I'm kind of nerdy, so. All right. Well, I appreciate your all's comments and input.